Before I get into the discussion for today's video, I want to give a quick shout out to Necroharmonic, a death metal label and distro located here in the United States, I believe in New Jersey, that I was able to get this crematory shirt from them for an extremely discounted price. And that all has to do with the fact that when I went to the Maryland Death Fest already now 3 weeks ago, Necroharmonic had their own distro there. And the owner, I believe his name is Roy Fox, noticed me. We chatted a bit because he watches my YouTube channel, surprisingly. And again, gave me this crematory shirt for just only 10 bucks. So I feel like the very least I can do is give a shout out to Necroharmonic, and in the description below, link you guys to their distro where they have some really killer shirt designs, even including some shirts by Crematory, which is just, again, an incredible old school Swedish death metal band. And just again, overall, thank you so much to Roy Fox for just hooking me up with some killer merch. In the previous two videos, I talked about the explicit history of black metal and death metal. Now it's time to talk about another personal favorite of mine in extreme music, that being the explicit history of grindcore. For a basic description of what grindcore is, it's a subgenre of extreme music that blends together styles such as hardcore punk, crust punk, noise rock, and forms of extreme metal, most particularly death metal. Musically speaking, grindcore is a very fast and abrasive subgenre within extreme music that I've always personally considered it to be the most chaotic of the bunch. The characteristics you'll find in grindcore is, for one, as I stated earlier, it's a very fast-paced subgenre in extreme music. So the tempo is always going to be cranked up to the highest. So expect songs to hit BPMs of like 200 and up easily. So when it comes to the drumming of grindcore, more often than not, it's going to be blast beats utilized all the time. As, to be honest with you, the origins of blast beats being implemented in extreme music can be found with the earliest examples of grindcore, which I'll be talking about a little bit later on in this video. As for the guitars being utilized with the riffs that you're hearing, if you can even call them that, is they're very down-tuned, they have loads of distortion attached with it, that more often than not, when I'm listening to a grindcore band, the guitar riffs just sound like a whirlwind of noise. As for the vocals, I would say grindcore has the widest range of vocal styles you'll hear, as in the previous two videos talking about black metal and death metal, even though there's range in between what you can find in those subgenres, there's always like a distinct sound with it. Like death metal has the low guttural growls, and black metal has more of like the high banshee shrieks. Well, in grindcore, you're going to find both of those approaches happening basically simultaneously with most bands. The lyrical themes typically are very politically charged, having to do with a lot with left-wing ideology. So you'll find ideas such as, anti-authority, anti-war, anti-capitalism, anti-fascism, or just really any pro-views on anarchy as a whole is what you'll find more often than not, whether it be from their album artwork to overall presentation. And I feel like a huge reason as to why that is because even though a lot of metal fans view grindcore as this extreme metal subgenre, in actuality, grindcore's origins stem from punk more than anything else with their ideology and aesthetics. Other lyrical themes you'll find in this style of music range between blood, gore, and violence to even forms of dark comedy pops up quite a bit. Two examples that I can give you can find in the Guinness Book of World Records. First one that is obviously the most known would be Napalm Death, You Suffer. It holds the record for the shortest commercial release song ever at 1.316 seconds long. And the other example holds the record for the shortest music video ever released, that being Brutal Truth's Collateral Damage, which I believe the music video clocks in roughly around 4.5 seconds long. Now, as for the historical timeline, it's mainly cited that grindcore started in the mid-80s, which is true, but when it comes to its origins and predecessors, we have to look a few years even earlier to the early 80s, where hardcore punk started bursting through. During this time for punk music into its adaptation to hardcore punk, things started to sound a bit rougher to the ears in terms of its production and overall style, as everything sounded meaner and heavier with all of the instrumentation. Earliest examples of this that start getting into the ideas now of what is now considered crust punk would be bands like Discharge and Amoebics, and I would even include some of the earliest releases by Crass fit into this description. However, what is undoubtedly the most important hardcore punk band for the development for grindcore would be a band based out of Massachusetts, out of all places, believe it or not. That being Siege, with their 1984 sole full-length album, Drop Dead. When you see the track listing for its original release in 1984, there was only 6 tracks, and of the 6, 3 of them were under a minute long, and the overall runtime for this album was a little over 12.5 minutes long. Musically, this album is played blisteringly fast and is nothing short of just sheer chaos from start to finish. With the guitar riffs being similar to that of what I discussed with grindcore, it's just a whirlwind of noise and abrasive sounds hitting you in all different directions. The vocals are nothing but just screaming and yelling on top of it to just add another layer of chaos to it. But what's interesting about it, though, is in terms of where it's embedded, it's definitely labeled within the punk and hardcore punk scene. But I would say for its time, this was one of, if not like the fastest hardcore punk album that was released in 1984. Because of this approach, it would influence a lot of the, early bands that we respect so much within grindcore. One example being Napalm Death took a lot of influence to this. But what's also important to bring out here that I want to discuss for a little bit is while this is viewed as this prototype harbinger to what grindcore was about to become, what it really impacted the most of would be this early example of what is now considered to be power violence. I don't want to dive too deep into the discussion of power violence. Maybe one day way down the road I might do a video of like the explicit history of power violence, or basically just try my best to do as many explicit history videos as I can. But what power violence basically is, in a simple definition, it's very adjacent to grindcore, but it does have some distinct characteristics different to it. Whereas I stated, grindcore is, hardcore punk, crust punk, noise rock, and death metal. So it's a combination of like forms of hardcore punk and forms of extreme metal together. Well, power violence is that same approach, only the extreme metal portions you find in grindcore, that is absolutely absent, and what takes the full center stage with power violence is just all extreme forms of punk music. Hence why, if you were to search up power violence and look at some of the bands that pop up, yeah, you'll come across bands labeled power violence, obviously, but others will be labeled with their genre tags such as power violence / grindcore, or power violence / hardcore punk. It's all incredibly adjacent to each other, but there are some noticeable differences with its characteristics. But bands worth mentioning if you want to get into it, and just gateway bands obviously would be Siege, the band I just talked about a second ago. Then there is Drop Dead from Providence, Rhode Island, that clearly took a lot of influence from Siege, as they named their band after Siege's album Drop Dead. And other bands worth mentioning that are just personal favorites of mine would be Man is the Bastard, Hell Nation, Combat Wounded Veteran, and Extortion. But anyways, getting back on track here with the conversation to grindcore, this now leads into what is considered to be the first ever grindcore band, Napalm Death. Considered by many as the first true example to what is considered to be grindcore, Scum has received legendary status and praise by generations of fans within this style of music that I really do feel like what makes this album so crucial and important here is the drummer Mick Harris, who really started to be one of the first examples of utilizing blast beats on a regular basis in extreme music. That for a lot of people, when we look at the origins of blast beats, even though they technically started in jazz music a few decades prior, when it comes to extreme music of really any sort, this is really where it began. It goes without saying, but Mick Harris is a legendary figure for not only just grindcore, but extreme music as a whole. As yes, he helped popularize the usage of blast beats and coin the term for blast beats, with this band and just with Napalm Death as a whole, but he also coined the term Grindcore. Even though Scum is a legendary album that a lot of people point as to the first example to a grindcore full length, to others this is still in the region of hardcore punk because it sounds a lot like Siege. It doesn't really have that extreme metal sound just yet, especially on the vocals that are just these grunted yells, again really within the region of hardcore punk, that a lot of people just look at this as being a very fast punk album and not the true embodiment to grindcore, which they wouldn't really become a true grindcore band until their follow-up album, From Enslavement to Obliteration, where there was a little bit more of this explosive extreme metal flavor with it. Like many conversations when it comes to the history and development of any genre, people always have this debate or discussion of who was the real first band to be insert genre. And here with grindcore, there is somewhat of a debate and discussion here, because while yes, the mass majority will say Napalm Death, mainly because they formed in the year 1981, if I'm not mistaken, the other band that is in question here for being the first grindcore band would come from Flint, Michigan, that being Repulsion. Even though Napalm Death formed earlier to Repulsion and had some demos, all of Napalm Death's demos before Scum was really deep within the influence of hardcore punk more than anything else. Yet when you listen to Repulsion's first demo from 1986, Slaughter of the Innocent, it's incredibly grainy and harsh and has a very lo-fi production value, as I believe they only had like $300 worth within studio time or whatever. What a lot of people point to is this is the first real embodiment of grindcore, of having those hardcore punk, crust punk, and noise rock influences, but really bringing forth the death metal aspect that makes this genre what it is. Then obviously 3 years later in 1989, they would redefine that demo into a full length, that being Horrified, which, I mean, if you're an extreme metal fan of any sort and you enjoy grindcore and you don't know of this, that is sacrilegious in my personal view. This is an absolute must know. As what Repulsion did here is, yeah, it's a more metal driven grindcore album. Like, there are still obviously the hardcore punk and crust punk elements to be heard here, but in terms of how they're playing their instruments, having more of like this almost death thrash edge to it, and the vocals that have more of that rugged death metal snarl, it really embodies like the whole melting pot of what is considered to be as today as grindcore. This seems to be somewhat of a pattern here with these past 3 videos of the explicit history of insert genre, but I just want to give my own personal take on it. And again, like always, this is just my personal opinion. It's not objective. Disagree with me if you want in the comments. But how I've always viewed it is Napalm Death and Repulsion technically are like the first examples of grindcore, but they're coming from 2 completely different directions, because again, grindcore is basically a melting pot of extreme genres of both punk and metal. In my personal view, Napalm Death is the first grindcore band to come out of the punk scene, whereas Repulsion is the first grindcore band to come out of the metal scene. That all being said, when it comes to the earliest developments for grindcore, more specifically in the 1980s, I gotta admit, this decade has grindcore at its most primitive and harshest, and there's a lot of gems to be found here. Most of those examples you can find all coming from the UK grindcore scene during the mid and late 80s. A perfect example of this would come from a band called Sore Throat with their 1988 full-length album Unhindered by Talent, that is just blistering fast, really hard-hitting, forms of hardcore punk, but really within the region of grindcore because of just how abrasive and noisy it was, that some people point to Sore Throat as this early harbinger to what noise grind is. Along with Extreme Noise Terror with their 1989 full-length album A Holocaust in Your Head, that's way more rooted again in crust punk, if anything, when it comes to the guitar riffs and some of the instrumentals. But during some of the faster and more chaotic parts, especially with the vocal department, it definitely leans into that grindcore aspect, that if you're looking for a more punk or crust punk driven approach to grindcore, Extreme Noise Terror with their early releases is a great representation of that. It's also worth mentioning this really short-lived band called Electro Hippies that I believe was active between like 1985 to 89 if I'm not mistaken, and it's just really short and sweet crust punk played really fast that gets within the region of grindcore on some aspects, especially when it comes to either the vocals or drum performance on a lot of their releases. It's just worth mentioning here because this would be one of the first bands that Jeff Walker was a part of until he started what most people know of him for, and being a huge pioneer for just extreme music as a whole, Carcass. For their time in the late 80s, Carcass redefined what it was to be extreme with their approach, as what they initially did with the vocals is they used a lot of voice modulators to enhance their vocals to something that was incredibly abnormal, that a lot of people view Carcass as being not only a pioneer to both like grindcore or death grind, but more particularly gore grind. I've done a video all about gore grind here on my channel about a year or two ago, so definitely watch that if you want a more in-depth description of what gore grind is. But to give you a shortened version, gore grind is a branch off of grindcore, as it basically plays a lot with the same characteristics of grindcore. It's very noisy, abrasive with those down-tuned guitars, yes, but the real distinct characteristics that are different is when it comes to the vocal department. Gore grind bands use a lot of pitch-shifted vocals that everything just sounds incredibly abnormal, along with the fact that when it comes to their aesthetics and presentation, at least with the album artwork and lyrical themes, it's extremely grotesque to the point that most of it can't even be shown on YouTube without my videos being taken down. Bands worth mentioning that are gateways into the styles of gore grind, of course, would be Carcass, as they are the innovators and pioneers to this style of music for a lot of people. Then there's Last Days of Humanity, which is debatably the first ever gore grind band to embody that sound 100%. Then you got bands like Zizma, Pathologist, Hemorrhage, and General Surgery. But getting back on track here with Carcass, they also influenced a style known as death grind, which really all this is still grindcore heavily embedded within that style. It just puts a lot more emphasis on the extreme metal aspect, that of course being death metal, hence why it's called death grind. And what I find interesting about this here is not only is Carcass innovators to death grind and would help pioneer the style for years to come, especially in the 90s, but lyrically and presentation wise, they still have that strong punk vibe with them, as a lot of their lyrical themes and presentation with their early albums had to do with like pro-vegan views of having these images of these decomposed bodies all look deteriorated, and it would persuade the listener not to be, you know, having the urge to eat any sort of meat. However, what ended up happening is, even though they have like the punk mindset with their presentation, they just gained a lot of metal fans because, again, of that aspect of extreme metal heavily being presented with their songwriting. So even though Carcass mentally and emotionally has the mindset of punk, musically they attracted all of the metal fans. The last inclusion I want to talk about when it comes to the UK grind scene of the 80s would be Bolt Thrower with their debut full-length album, In Battle There Is No Law, which, yes, I know we all know of Bolt Thrower as these colossal titans when it comes to death metal, especially with all of their stuff having to do with Warhammer 40k. But their debut full-length album, there's no way you can't tell me there's a strong presence of grindcore embedded with some of the more chaotic parts, that I would state what they did with their debut full-length album here is it's a death grind album that kind of fits with the timeline of all of the wild grind bands coming out of the UK scene during the 80s. It's crucial to talk about the UK grind scene during the 80s because it really helped propel grindcore to be its own unique entity within the world of extreme music, and there were two key variables that really helped to propel it to the next level, one of which being a record label called Earache Records. Though Earache Records doesn't have the same reputation that it has now, Back then in the late 80s and early 90s, this was the label to know about if you wanted to get into extreme music of really any kind, and they were gaining quite a bit of momentum. And when you look at their roster from the late 80s and early 90s, a lot of bands that we consider to be innovators and pioneers for at least grindcore for this topic, you would find it on Earache. So I can only imagine during that point being alive and seeing all of this being unleashed to the world from this one label, it gained this style of music a lot of traction. And the other component being this radio host, John Peel, who during his time in the UK music journalist and radio host scene, this guy was a monumental figure that had legendary status already in the 80s. And during that time, he had more interest with playing hardcore music, as again, that was starting to become a thing around the UK music scene. And during the mid-80s, he would play on his radio Napalm Death, and even Carcass, I believe, that, you know, hearing that style of music on the radio during the 80s, where that was where a lot of people got their music from, this helped propel grindcore, as I stated, to the next level in terms of popularity and selling records. It's universally known that the UK grind scene played a vital role into the development for grindcore as we understand it today, making it its own unique entity within extreme music that would be recognized by so many extreme music fans to come. And I believe the reason as to why that is so many legacy acts that we consider today came from the UK, and it being in this one concentrated area really helped propel it to the next level. But even though the UK definitely dominated the whole grindcore scene during the 80s, it wasn't the only place having bands come forth playing in this style. That when we start checking out different countries with different bands, you know, bit by bit, we start noticing now that grindcore is kind of more not so much of this national thing in the UK, but more of an international thing worldwide. Obviously in the United States there was Repulsion, a band I just talked about earlier on in this video, but the next heavy hitter that was in the style of grindcore in the United States during the late 80s would be Terrorizer with their 1989 full-length World Downfall. Another album released by Earache, by the way, but in terms of their musical direction, it was a mixture of death metal and grindcore, which makes the absolute most amount of sense when you look at the lineup, as it consisted of members that were either in or going to be in Morbid Angel and Napalm Death. So the ideas are there from the start. Along with the fact when it comes to the album artwork and presentation, I know they're not the first to do it, as arguably Napalm Death's Scum is the first example of it. But having the album artwork be a collage of all different political figures, both negatively and positively, to what they're trying to present to the audience with their lyrical themes on the album artwork, was another thing they kind of helped propel. But yes, in terms of just death metal grindcore, death grind in this case, it's an absolute essential to know, and another just monumental piece for the development of grindcore. Then there's Nuclear Death, that formed in 1986, that I've never seen anyone ever talk about when it comes to grindcore bands that they enjoy, or just really the earliest developments of grindcore. Nuclear Death always seems to get the cold shoulder for some reason. But they formed in 1986 and they released quite a handful of demos. But their album from 1990, Birds of Insect, is just an absolute face melter that, I don't know, maybe it's because of like the lo-fi production, how the bass is being played. Everything about it just sounds really sloppy and messy, but it adds to the charm of that primitive, vicious nature of it all. It's also worth mentioning with Nuclear Death that the mastermind behind it, who does the vocals and guitars here, her name is Lori Bravo. She's widely considered to be the first ever woman frontman within extreme music, and extreme metal in this case, which I always thought was really cool to know. And make no mistake about it, her vocal performance on this album, along with everything else that they did in the 80s, is just as intense and in your face as any man vocalist you could name. Along with Impetigo, that formed back in 1987, and even though their debut full-length album wasn't released until 1990, they had quite a bit of demos and an EP prior to it, that again is within the region of death grind, of death metal and grindcore, bouncing off of each other, of the barbarity of death metal meets the chaos of grindcore. And what's interesting about Impetigo, Nuclear Death, and Repulsion is unlike most of what was happening in the UK with its grindcore scene of being very politically charged with its lyrics or presentation, a lot of the grindcore adjacent bands that came on the 80s in the United States really focused a lot more on these grotesque, gory, violent themes and lyrical ideas with their approach. And I think that has to do with the fact that mainly death metal was still quite of a big thing being brewed up in the United States, especially when you consider that New York and Florida had things cooking throughout that time. And I think that really started to, bleed forth into other bands that were experimenting with more of a grindcore take of that chaotic spot. Thus, we're seeing that become more of a thing at first in the United States. And while Terrorizer really is like the first grindcore band in the United States to really bring forth more of a political aspect with their approach, make no mistake about it, in the 80s within the United States for grind, that violence and grotesque imagery was really dominating it at first. Other areas that had grindcore emerging would be in Brazil in 1986, this band called Gorilla, which had the members of Sepultura, I believe the Cavaleira brothers, along with members of Mutilator together. And from what I heard online, this is just like noise. Like, there's not much out you can make from it, but it's still quite interesting to know something of this caliber, as abrasive as it was, came out of Brazil in 1986. And it's also worth mentioning another band, and debatably like the first grindcore band to incorporate black metal elements into their sound, and they were also from Brazil, would be this band called Necroharmonic, which is just as sloppy and abrasive as Gorilla, but it's still interesting to know that there was elements of black metal kind of seeping its way into grindcore this early on. It'd be a crime for me not to include the band Blood with their 1989 full-length album Impulse to Destroy, that they formed in 1986 and had quite a handful of demos prior to it, but Blood is debatably one of, if not the first, grindcore band formed in Germany. But they also mix together a lot of forms of extreme metal and death metal to get into that approach again of death grind, that they're one of the earliest examples you can find of just purebred death grind being unleashed to the world. It's just they kind of got swept under the rug for the most part because they aren't talked about nearly as much as any other like early harbinger to death grind. And I think a reason for that could be the success of other names that we already know. But make no mistake about it, if you want to get more familiar with the earliest harbingers to death grind or its pioneers, Blood is an absolute must-know. And I'd also like to include a Switzerland grindcore band from the mid-80s called Fear of God. For some reason, they're not in the metal archives, and I don't understand why. They're kind of weird and nitpicky when it comes to what they induct for grindcore, but Fear of God is another just killer grindcore band that doesn't get talked about enough, that leans kind of into the same territory of the band Sore Throat I talked about earlier, that it's really abrasive and almost can be characterized as noise grind, and this is a great example of that, where basically all noise grind is, that I can tell you, is how I talked about earlier, the melting pot of grindcores that has also noise rock into it. Well, noise grind is basically, hey, let's just put more attention on that noise rock aspect and make everything all the more abrasive, all the more harsh, and all the more just, gritty with the production value. And just the overall distortion and sound of this, it can be labeled as such as noise grind. But still, Fear of God is always swept under the rug, or just people don't know of it. And it's, again, just another killer grindcore band that emerged in the 1980s. While on the topic of 80s grindcore, it's stated that the UK and the United States were really the dominant countries that had forms of grindcore emerging, with everything else being scattered kind of internationally. But I would say the other country that doesn't get enough recognition, I personally feel like, for having a pretty strong grindcore scene, even though it really didn't come to fruition until like the 90s and early 2000s, but in the mid-80s they had something brewing, would be Japan. Very similar to the timeline with the UK punk scene, Japan had a pretty big hardcore punk scene pop through during the early 80s. Noticeable names would be the SS, Gauze, and Gizm. I state this for all of Japanese music, not just its hardcore punk scene, but just literally every genre you can think of that's had a scene within Japan. They always take it to like the next level. It feels like every single Japanese extreme music act from any time period would always perform and release albums as if it's their last night on Earth. They're going guns blazing, going as extreme and chaotic as possible. And with their hardcore punk scene, it's absolutely no different from the names I've mentioned. But I really do feel like that got the wheels spinning for more extreme acts to follow up. Thus, when we get to the mid-80s, we're starting to see bands that kind of resemble what people consider to be grindcore. One of the earliest examples you can come across of Japanese grindcore would come from a band called SOB, which stands for Sabotage Organized Barbarian, who's been around since 1983 when they formed. And if you listen to their 1987 full-length album, Don't Be Swindle, it's grindcore in spirit, but there's also a lot of elements of this crossover thrash metal hardcore punk that some people characterize as thrashcore, if that's an actual thing, if you want to call it that. Regardless though, it's really interesting to hear that all the way in Japan during this time in the 80s, there was forms of grindcore starting to emerge, and as I stated, SOB is characterized as one of the earliest examples of it in this country. As for a really deep cut that's kind of obscure within Japanese grindcore, would come from a band called Motoku, who formed in the early to mid 80s, I believe, and they have a demo called Murderous Tapes from 1986 that's more in the region of experimental noise rock and forms of hardcore punk, but during some of these portions on this demo, you can hear in the mid portions of it, it gets really chaotic that it resembles a very noisy lo-fi take of grindcore. That I know Motoku is not ever going to be brought up in like grindcore pioneers, but it's just, again, interesting to see that in Japan just how chaotic their punk scene was. There would be bands that would just be very adjacent to this approach. Yet, one component that I feel like doesn't get brought up enough when it comes to the development of grindcore in Japan would be the other big music scene that was developing during this time in Japan. That, of course, being their noise scene, which, you know, another topic for another day of like the explicit history of noise music, maybe, but Japan had stuff like Merzbow, the Gorigeri Gegege, and Hanatarash, where, yeah, it's nothing to do with grindcore, yes, but it's very noisy, it's abrasive, it's chaotic, and again, I feel like in spirit, it had like this semi-punk mindset with it, that there would be acts that down the road would help develop grindcore a bit. Of the bunch I just mentioned of noise projects, the one that really stands out here for this video would be Hanatarash, a noise project I did a video all about earlier on this year. That, yeah, it's a noise project and they had the mindset of like the punk attitude, but the reason why they're significant for this video is mainly because of their vocalist Yamataka Ai, which he was also part of another band called The Boredoms, which is more in the region now of like experimental noise rock, if anything. But what makes Yamataka Ai so significant here is his vocals are so incredibly signature because it's so incredibly over the top every time, and especially you can hear that on The Boredoms, which I really do feel like, even though he wasn't a part of any grindcore band just yet explicitly, his over-the-top vocal approach was making things a bit more compatible for other forms of like abrasive, crazy music, and I really do feel like he played a key figure into the development for more just wild music to come out of Japan. Other than that, the only other thing really to worth mention here in terms of anything to do with grindcore in the 80s would be a band from Belgium called Agathocles. Formed in 1987, Agathocles has just become this non-stop force of releasing albums, as if you look up their discography, it exceeds well over 100 releases and then some, a majority of which being splits, that if you were able to gather everything in their discography, you would have to have won like the lottery and then some, because it's just so incredibly large. Agathocles being just such a prolific band and still going to this day. But what makes them significant is not only are they one of the earliest formed grindcore bands and just having this large discography, but they helped create this, I guess, little branch off of grindcore called mincecore. Debatably, mincecore is like the most niche thing that I'm aware of, at least when it comes to anything adjacent to grindcore. Its differences being is that mincecore adapts the whole lyrical themes of grindcore. It's very politically charged, having to do a lot with left-wing ideology, yes, but it also adapts ideas of gore grind and hardcore punk simultaneously. So it's like a melting pot of subgenres that were already a part of another melting pot, just all forged together is kind of what I understand with mincecore. Because of Agathocles creating this microgenre known as mincecore, years down the road bands would adapt this approach and be influenced by it. One of which being Archhagathus, which their album artwork is just absolutely ridiculous. But again, they're taking that form of grind, gore grind, and hardcore punk and just having all of those styles bounce off of each other. That in terms of their overall presentation and what they sound musically, it's very over the top and foolish, but plays into its charm a bit, while also being very politically charged as well, if you were to look up some of the lyrics that they present. The only other band worth mentioning that is a bigger name for mincecore standards would be Haggis, a band I had the pleasure of seeing at the Maryland Death Fest like 3 or 4 weeks ago now. That, again, it's that style just all bouncing off of each other, but it's just ludicrous and really fun to witness. That I would recommend Haggis, especially if you want to get an idea of what mincecore is all about, both musically and aesthetically. Oh, and I almost forgot before we get into the 90s era. If you're wondering what's playing in the background, that would be the debut full-length album, self-titled, by the band called Old, which stands for Old Lady Drivers, released in 1988. This is very tongue-in-cheek, humorous grindcore lyrically, but it's also some of the most deranged grindcore that I know, and that mainly has to do with the fact of the vocal performance done by Alan Dublin, who is mainly known for being in Kane, a band he would start like 10 or 15 years after. But some of his earliest work you can find musically would come from Old, with Old Lady Drivers, that I feel like it's a hidden gem that I've never seen anyone talk about. But again, if you want just deranged sounding grindcore, definitely check this out. As we reach the turn of the decade into the 1990s, this is where I feel like grindcore really started to peak, not only in terms of quality with albums, but also innovation, as bands were being a little bit more experimental in some points, while also giving grindcore a more, focused identity in terms of lyrical direction, showcasing that it had a clear head on its shoulders. During the early 1990s, this is where I feel like grindcore, at least in the United States, started getting with the program of being a little bit more political with their overall lyrical themes, and two big heavy hitters emerged. One of which being Brutal Truth with their 1992 full-length album, Extreme Conditions Demand Extreme Responses. How I always viewed Brutal Truth is they are really one of the most respected grindcore bands, yes, but they're equivalent to that of being the United States version of Napalm Death. Their lyrical themes are very politically charged, all of their songs tend to be very short and extremely fast-paced, and they just radiated everything that grindcore kind of stood for, both in presentation and musically. That, they're an absolute essential when it comes to getting into this style of music, without question. The other band that was quite important for the earliest development of United States grindcore would be Assuck, with their 1991 full-length album, Anti-Capital. An album that consists of 17 tracks and it clocks in a little over 15 minutes long, with an average runtime per song a little under a minute. That's as grindcore as it kind of gets in terms of the track listing. But musically, it's more akin to that, to death metal at least, with the vocals, as it's more deeper with its growls. But in terms of themes and lyrics, very politically charged, that has that punk mindset, that I feel like Assuck was kind of like the total package for bringing forth what grindcore truly represented from the UK onto United States soil. In terms of innovation for grindcore during this particular time period, there's one musician that always comes to mind that took this subgenre and turned it on its head, that being John Zorn. For those who don't know who John Zorn is, he's a composer and saxophonist who's deeply tied within the music styles of modern classical, jazz, and free jazz music. That during the late 80s and early 90s, he had a stronger fascination with hardcore music and forms of grindcore, as I believe he was kind of a fan of Napalm Death to begin with, that he started blending all of that together with some of his music projects. Standouts, of course, would be Painkiller and Naked City. His standout work for many, including myself, as it's one of my all-time favorite albums in music overall, would be John Zorn's Naked City, released in 1990. An album that just makes absolutely no sense, and even during the normal portions of it, it still feels like it's going off the rails because you don't know what to expect after it. It's a mixture of, I don't know, like blues rock, then sometimes classical, then rock jazz, free jazz, grindcore, just all swirling out of control, that you could almost call this like jazz grind, I guess is what some people call it. But my God, I've listened to this album dozens upon dozens of times, and even so, I'm still like at a loss for words. It still surprises me, all the chaos that ensues on it. And it brought grindcore into a realm that I just don't think anyone thought it could go under or just do. And to this day, already now 35 years later, there's really nothing quite like hearing some of the earliest works of John Zorn when he was really interested with more of like this grindcore approach he would incorporate with free jazz. It's also worth mentioning that Yamataka Ai, that individual I talked about earlier that was a part of Hanatarash and the Boredoms, well, you can hear his vocals on this album, and it just adds another layer of chaos ensuing upon everything, because to hear all the wild blast beats and John Zorn's saxophone sounding like this, I don't know, duck screaming for its life in agony, just, it's a whirlwind of just noises that shouldn't make sense. Having grindcore and free jazz like clash into each other like this should not make sense, but somehow it does. And I don't know if it's because they were playing free jazz just so obnoxiously aggressive that it mirrors the just chaos aggression of grindcore, which works 50-50. I don't know. But this album is unlike anything else that you can hear. And as I stated, 35 years later, there's nothing truly like it. But it's worth mentioning with Yamataka Ai being on this record that he was also a part of other bands and projects that John Zorn was doing, such as Painkiller. If you were to listen to any of the early albums by Painkiller, it's quite similar to that to Naked City. The difference being they put a little bit more emphasis on the grindcore aspect, mainly having to do with the fact that, for one, it's signed to Earache, another band signed to that label during this time, and two, the drummer on Painkiller would be Mick Harris, who at this point he's been disbanded from Napalm Death during the early 90s, and he's putting his work on now to Painkiller with John Zorn and company. Thus again, what you're hearing is more influence of grindcore, as I stated, that I would say if you want to get into John Zorn, if you're like really a metal fan and if you're aware of grindcore, you should start off with Painkiller and then go to Naked City. As incredible as all of John Zorn's work was, that I would just recommend to anyone who wants music that pushes boundaries in any sense, regardless if you are a fan of grindcore or not, or free jazz or not, definitely check him out. But believe it or not, John Zorn wasn't the only individual creating this hybrid blend of free jazz and grindcore. There's even some groups that predate him. One of those groups being Last Exit, with their 1988 full-length album, Iron Path. They're labeled as a jazz supergroup, and I'm not going to pretend like I know who these individuals are, because when it comes to my knowledge of jazz music, I know next to nothing. But one name that did stand out to me, because I have heard of him before with some of his previous work that's really sporadic and crazy within the realms of free jazz, is that Peter Brotzman plays on this album. His saxophone playing is absurdly aggressive and all over the place, just like John Zorn, who I compare him to, only he just predates John Zorn by quite a handful of decades. But you're hearing Peter Brotzman really playing his saxophone almost in the sense now he's trying to appeal to metal fans. Whether that was the intention or not, I'm not sure. But when you hear the drumming being played over the saxophone and all the other stringed instruments kind of melding together here, it sounds like a really extreme version of free jazz that, again, mirrors the ideas of what John Zorn would do only a few years later, of like that jazz grind hybrid effect. And the other band being Scrawl, an experimental jazz grind band from Germany that formed in 1989, and in 1995 they released their debut full-length album, Q, and it's only 15 minutes long. Dozens of tracks are on the album, but it's a mixture of, again, jazz, rock, grind, ska, swing. Like, there's so many random genres just being tagged under this that you have to hear it to like truly believe it and understand it. But again, it's in that vein of like John Zorn, jazz grind, and just a bunch of like random things going and leaving your eardrums that, I don't know, it's kind of like this organized chaos is kind of what this album is. That, I mean, it's definitely worth checking out. Again, it's only 15 and a half minutes long, and I can guarantee you it's really hard to compare this to anything else. But integrating jazz into grindcore wasn't the only form of innovation happening during this time. As well, during the early 90s, a band called Human Remains would start releasing some material. And some of their EPs and demos, you can hear it being considered as technical death grind, as this is one of the earliest examples, to my knowledge anyway, of more technicality being induced with anything within the region of grindcore, as guitar riffs are a lot more now than just, you know, a whirlwind of noise. There's some technicality and some actual structure with it now, and Human Remains showcase that that can be done. Even though grindcore was starting to flourish more during this time and have a little bit more innovation come forth, this is also the same time period where there would be some infamy. Of course, I'm now talking about Anal Cunt. Their vocalist, Seth Putnam, is absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, the most infamous individual with anything that has to do with grindcore. Regardless if you're hearing someone who knew him personally, of a musician, to the fans that witnessed their shows, everything about them, from their album artwork, band name, stage antics, song titles, and attitude, was to provoke you in some kind of a way. Whether that was intentional by the group because they truly believed this, or they wanted to just have this lowbrow, really degenerate sense of humor, regardless of how you look at it, Anal Cunt got people talking about them in some way, shape, or form. In terms of their musicianship skill, as politely as I can say, it's nothing that I would state is professional. If anything, they really embodied the mindset of a degenerate in every which way possible, as I stated, and that also means musically, as it's just grindcore in its most stripped down state. It's just like noisecore is basically what it started turning into. This might be somewhat of a stretch on my behalf and my like one really big hot take here, but I feel like a reason as to why people view grindcore that it's a bit foolish and silly and has like the ideas of like dark comedy attached with its lyrical themes, I really do feel like the reason for that is because of Anal Cunt. Just this band alone. It's crazy to think if you were to look up some of the earliest bands in this style of music, or just look up grindcore as a whole, somehow Anal Cunt will pop up with some of the recommendations, surprisingly. And I really do feel like, again, if we're looking at the more comedic, lowbrow, degenerative sense of grindcore in every which way possible, both musically and presentation-wise, yeah, I really do believe it's because of them. What's interesting to point out here is with every increments of 5 or 10 years with grindcore, while there are some portions where it develops and has some bit of innovation, it always still kind of kept with the same mindset and structure, because, you know, all these increments we would always still get newer grindcore bands, that the overall styling of, you know, that stripped down grindcore approach wasn't so much of a national thing as I stated earlier on with the UK, but it started becoming international as all these other bands were just really adapting that really basic sound and just continuing it within their own region. Examples of this can be in Japan, where bands like Unholy Grave, Gore Beyond Necropsy, and Claudet's Symmetric Sexual Organ, I know, a lovely name, just all kind of played this stripped down approach of fast abrasive grindcore. Or in France, you would have Blockheads, Italy would have Crippled Bastards, and Brazil would have a band called Rot. Or in Germany with the band Naked Whipper with their album Pain Streaks, that I would credit them for being one of the first ever bands to really incorporate grindcore into more of the that Bastille types of extreme metal acts of Blasphemy, Revenge, Conqueror, those kind of bands. Naked Whipper was an early example of showcasing more of a grindcore aspect to it, that if you want a mixture between Sarcophago meets Napalm Death, definitely check these guys out. But as we reach into the mid-90s up until the early 2000s, grindcore would once again start experimenting a bit, and this is where we get into one of those examples being cybergrind. I'm not going to go too much into description with cybergrind because I've done a video all about cybergrind here on my channel about a month and a half ago, so definitely check that out if you want a more in-depth description with this micro-genre. But cybergrind, by definition, is just basically think of grindcore as it is, and you apply any form of electronic music with it, and that could range from a drum machine to a synthesizer, and by definition, that counts as cybergrind as it's so incredibly fluid. So think of forms of either industrial, synth pop, gabber, and hardcore techno, drum and bass, anything that is latched on to any form of electronic music, you blend that with grindcore, by definition it becomes cybergrind. Once again, let me remind you, if you want a more in-depth description about cybergrind, watch my video all about it. But the two acts that are to be must known here for the innovators, pioneers, and just, the head helm of what cybergrind is all about, one would be the Berserker, that when you look at their early beginnings with some of their demos and EPs, they were not really a band at that point. They were more of a hardcore techno type of project that they were integrated with during that time in the mid-90s. And really what they did is they took that approach and integrated it within grindcore. When you start listening to some of their early full-length albums, that even though it's labeled grindcore, its overall foundation rests on the shoulders of hardcore techno. And the other noteworthy name would be Agoraphobic Nosebleed. Since day one, when they formed in the mid-90s, they have embodied the idea of cybergrind to its fullest extent. Whether it be from their programmed drums to all the weird, wacky sounds of electronics that go all over the place, if you want the most unadulterated take of what cybergrind is all about, you'll find it with Agoraphobic Nosebleed. But I would say the band that truly made a name for themselves during the mid-90s up into the early 2000s that was playing in the style of grindcore but doing things a little bit unorthodox would be Discordance Axis. While maintaining the intense and chaotic sound of grindcore, they were able to play their guitar riffs at a very technical level, which is another early example of technical grindcore that was just very unorthodox for their time, and even for today's standards it's quite rare to come across. Along with the fact that John Chain's vocal performance, he had a lot of range with it. He could sound just absolutely batshit insane to just sounding like a madman when it came to his grunts. He had a lot of diversity with his vocals. That's why I would say he had a bit more of a signature sound, which is really difficult to come across in grindcore, considering that it's either be high raspy screams or low guttural grunts. John Chang was able to make something signature out of that. And the real standout characteristic about them is lyrically with their themes, it was a lot more personal, dealing with inner struggles, which, for grindcore, it was either be political or have just blood, guts, and gore and violence all over the place, which I know for their time they were considered to be a bit pretentious with their approach, but in retrospect now they're considered to be quite innovators for this style of grind. Even though they disbanded in the early 2000s, it's worth mentioning that their sound and approach would continue on for years to come, as really John Chang being at the head helm of vocals with all different other members coming and going would continue on this approach of technical grindcore, that being either Gridlink or their newest band that they only did one album with, that being No One Knows What the Dead Thinks. As I was doing research for this video and looking up all different grindcore bands or death grind bands, one thing I really started to notice quite quickly is that during the late 90s, like 1999 and the early 2000s, there would be quite the influx of grindcore bands forming. I wish I could tell you guys with confidence as to what exactly started this, as to why there was this influx during the late 90s and early 2000s. All I can state is some educated guesses that maybe it's because grindcore with its development started off kind of slowly with bands forming, and that after a decade and a half of existing, this time period was the period where bands started forming more, or the fact that maybe because of nu metal coming into play, it being very mainstream, grindcore being very, you know, obscure and underground, was more of like this rebellious take against that. I don't know, but what I can just tell you this again is that the early 2000s and late 90s, there was quite the influx. During the early 2000s, one country that definitely had quite the spike that is not talked about enough and I think is super underappreciated, and one day I really want to do a video all about this country's extreme music scene, but for this video I can only talk about their grindcore scene, that being the Czech Republic. Like, I'm not exaggerating here, the Czech Republic has just such wild stuff coming out of that country, and it deserves to be talked about here. And I think one humongous reason as to why the Czech Republic has now kind of become this hotspot of like crazy music, especially when it comes to grindcore, is this is the country that hosts this festival called the Obscene Extreme Music Fest, which they have their own YouTube channel. I would recommend subscribing to it because the footage they gather of the bands that play at this festival is just absolutely nothing short of just pure lunacy and absolute fun to like this form of like ecstasy is what this shit looks like. And I would love to attend that festival one day, but I really do feel like having something like that in a country like Czech Republic would only encourage more wild grindcore to come out of. Some bands I want to give a little bit of attention to that came out of the Czech Republic and really releasing some wild stuff during the early 2000s. For one that comes to mind would be this band called TOOH, which abbreviates to the Obliteration of Humanity. They're labeled under the genre tag of progressive death grind, not really something you come across all that much. And from all the albums they were releasing during the early 2000s, it's that wild take of death grind that's really pulverizing, but at the same time there's structure with it. It connects to a different melody or a different sound that has a little bit more of a thought out, composition with it, which is not really, again, something you think of with any form of grindcore. And the Obliteration of Humanity is a group that I think is so underappreciated that if you want some really well thought out death grind, definitely check this out. Also, side note, they're going to be at next year's Maryland Death Fest, and I absolutely need to make their show. Then there's the Contrastic, who released an album, I believe, in the year 2000, if I'm not mistaken, and it always stood out to me mainly because of the album artwork having this Little Mermaid picture colored in that. I believe it's done by one of the band members' daughters, if I'm not mistaken, how this kind of came into effect for their album artwork. Regardless, though, what makes this such a standout is it's labeled grindcore, but it's really experimental, but in a very fun, bombastic way. It's nothing pretentious, as you have forms of funk, electronics, and even forms of like groove metal and nu metal, which I know is like sacrilegious to include in extreme metal, but they do it in such a really well thought out way, which is the thing with a lot of Czech Republic grindcore. It's chaotic but also thought out at the same time, and Contrastic has always been a personal favorite of mine. That if you want, like, man, I would say the earliest demo by Slipknot, but as a grindcore band, that's what this is, and it is absolutely sensational of a release that I dare you to find anything similar to this. And the last band I want to talk about for early 2000s Czech grindcore would be this band called Melancholy Pessimism that released quite a handful of albums during this time period, that it's labeled under the genre tag, which is a mouthful, experimental technical death grind, which I know is a lot, but you don't really come across stuff like this. that you're starting to notice now with a lot of these Czech Republic grind bands. It's chaotic, but also well composed, which they found the sweet spot to doing it, or there's something in the water that they're drinking to make them think like this. I don't know, but either way, Melancholy Pessimism, one way I could describe it is think of Cryptopsy's Blasphemy Made Flesh, but just even more chaotic, more bombastic, more just, you know, sporadic with how it's composed, and just, oh, it is so good. Seriously, I know this seems like just such a random pull, but the Czech Republic grindcore scene is really unique. At the same time, the Japanese grindcore scene started to flourish all the more, where it started out over the top and super gnarly, and it stayed over the top and super gnarly. For my personal taste, one grindcore band from Japan that's always stood out to me would be these guys. That being Swarm, with their 2003 full-length album, The Imitation Messiahs. The only reason I'm showcasing the vinyl here and it's not a JPEG is I just got this last week, and I've been wanting this on the LP format for years, and it finally got pressed. In terms of what you're going to hear, it's very intense, chaotic grindcore, which I know is nothing new, as that's kind of like the adjectives I've been using in this video numerous times with a lot of these bands. It's just what makes Swarm a little bit different is, on one hand, the vocals, it sounds like they take a lot of influence from Yamataka Eye, which is a big plus because it's really just intense vocals no matter what tempo they're playing, whether it be slow, mid-pace, or fast. You cannot ignore the vocals on this album. Then in other portions, when it comes to the guitars, yeah, it has that whirlwind-like of abrasive noise, but there's other portions where it gets a little bit melodic or a little bit technical to break up everything to have standout portions. The drumming on here, yeah, obviously there's blast beats, but there's other parts that it slows down and gets a bit, you know, groove-oriented. There's just a lot of things that shake up the formula that Swarm did on this album, and it's always been such the standout to me that if you really want an intense, chaotic grindcore album while also being kind of a bit refreshing, definitely check these guys out. Again, it's Swarm, but with 3 R's. And of course, I need to mention Flagitious Idiosyncrasy in the Dilapidation. With a name like that, how can you not want to know what they sound like? What it is a grindcore band that formed, I believe, in 2001, that it's 4 members, it's all women, and they're all like under 5 feet tall, like they're all short and kind of like adorable looking, but all of their live performances that I've seen online that you can witness, they put on some intense shows, and the vocalist, her range and her gutturals, it is just wicked stuff that I know maybe I'm focusing more on their presentation as a band, but they bring it. They honestly bring it, and I would recommend to anyone, as ridiculous as the band name is, and maybe even the image of like these small Asian women playing grindcore, it's killer stuff. So again, definitely check out Flagitious Idiosyncrasy and the Dilapidation. Just rolls right off the tongue. And I'll also recommend to you guys this band called 324 with their debut full-length album from the year 2000. Once again, it's nothing groundbreaking. A lot of these songs are going to be a minute and change at most, but it's just really fun, really energetic grindcore that if you want to extend your playlist all the more of just purebred grind, definitely check out 324. Oh, and how can I also forget for this time period for Japanese grindcore, that being Septistar Sept, a really prolific noise grind band that has so many releases under their belt and a handful of splits, demos, and full lengths. But all it is, it's just two people, one being this woman who's really short, again, like probably under 5 feet tall, who plays bass, which her bass guitar looks bigger than her, and one dude who's always in his underwear playing drums, and it is just super ignorant, primitive noise grind that all they're doing is just making noise, and that is absolutely it. That if you want just ignorant, abrasive music, Septistar Sept has a plethora to check out. The same effect would also happen in the United States, just with even more bands coming into fruition. A few that have always stood out to me, one would be Flesh Parade with their EP Kill Whitey, that is just really straightforward and super stripped down, just grindcore that is just speed on top of speed on top of speed. That's all it is. The guitar riffs, which you can't even call it that, all they're doing is just shifting their hand up and down the neck of the guitar just to create noise, if anything. The vocals are just super ear-piercing with their wretched screams that, again, it's really hard to ignore. It's nothing like distinct or groundbreaking or innovative, but just performed and executed extremely well. If you just want unhinged speed, velocity in grindcore, definitely check out Flesh Parade. The same can also be said to this band called Dahmer with their full-length album that really short, sweet, and is played in the same style as Flesh Parade. It's basically the same exact thing in terms of the musicianship on here that, again, I would recommend to anyone who's a fan of grind. Then there's Circle of Dead Children. That what makes them quite a standout is with their approach, they were blending forms of brutal death metal into their sounds of death grind that I would recommend you guys them if you're looking for more of a heavier and darker sound. Along with death grind being more of a thing in the United States, obviously noteworthy names to that would be stuff like Exhumed and Impaled. But the standout band of the early 2000s in the United States that made a real big name for themselves, that a lot of people view them for bringing back the sounds of grindcore as a whole for a new decade, would go to Pig Destroyer with their album Prowler of the Yard, which has been praised to death for years now for being like this real big monumental piece of United States grindcore that is really emotive, dark, and twisted, whether it be from the lyrics, the vocal presentation and execution, to even the instrumentation on here. From my own personal experience, Pig Destroyer is the first grindcore band that I'm pretty sure I discovered on my own at the time as I was getting familiar to all different styles of extreme metal, that regardless if you find Pig Destroyer to be like false grind, which, you know, they started becoming a little bit too groove oriented and kind of sacrifice some of their chaotic sounds for groove. Regardless, however, Pig Destroyer absolutely is a gateway band for a lot of people, especially if you're getting into grindcore during the 2000s. Pig Destroyer was like the band to know. But I would say the band that truly did something unique and special within this time period in the United States would be Cephalic Carnage with their 2005 full-length album, Anomalies. God, one way I could put this album is a work of art in the most intense and bombastic ways possible. It plays within the style of technical grindcore, really similar to that to Discordance Axis, but there are so many layers upon layers upon layers and subgenres piled on top of each other that it may sound like a clusterfuck of a mess at first with just so many things happening, but how they're able to compose everything to flow so fluidly, I can guarantee you will be in awe hearing this album from start to finish, that it's something that truly pushed boundaries for this genre. Also at the same time, there was finally some activity happening in the Nordic countries, which is interesting so far when it comes to either black metal or death metal that I've talked about previously. It seemed like the Nordic countries were like the go-to place for extreme metal. Yet when it comes to grindcore, it being more influenced by punk music, they're in the minority here. As during this portion, standout bands for, like, you know, either in Finland or Sweden would be either Rotten Sound and Nasum that came from Finland, or this band called Gadget that came from Sweden. However, when it comes to Norway, even though it's practically almost non-existent with their grindcore scene, they do have some standouts that I want to talk about that, again, I've never seen anyone ever talk about. And it's all basically done by the same dude. I can't think of his name right now, but one of his projects is called Brutal Blues, which I would argue this is an example of what can be considered as like dissonant grindcore almost, or like atmospheric grindcore. I know it sounds incredibly pretentious how I'm naming it, but there's so much reverb from all the instrumentation from either the vocals or the guitars that it kind of gives off that dissonant effect that I've just never heard before in grindcore. Maybe there's just other things that I've yet to discover that can be similar to this. But Brutal Blues has always been like this weird oddball that, again, I've just never ever seen anyone ever talk about. And what's also done by the same individual, again another example of Norwegian grindcore, would be this band called Sudoku, which is nicknamed as Space Grind. And what this is some really unique stuff, as it sounds like a mixture between the technicality of Discordance Axis meets the wild free jazz, avant-garde takes of John Zorn clashing into each other here. That it's a one-of-a-kind band. I'm really bummed they weren't able to make it to this year's Maryland Death Fest. And if you want another just standout of a weird as fuck oddball within this extreme music genre, Sudoku is unlike really anything else I've ever heard. While on the subject matter of Nordic grindcore, I did mention earlier with Sweden they had this band called Gadget. But another standout of theirs that kind of plays within the lyrical themes now of more of a comedic, lowbrow sense would be this band called Birdflesh. That they're mainly known because whenever they perform live, they dress up in these wild costumes and have all of these props being thrown around whenever they're at a show. And it's more of like what I would consider as like party grind. I mean, just look up one of their live performances, understand. As for their music, it's really more of this groove and hook-oriented forms of grindcore. There's a lot more rhythm attached with it, mainly because it has more of like this death metal and punk aspect with some of their guitar riffs. Regardless though, Birdflesh is just a really fun band that one day I hope to catch live. Speaking of Birdflesh having more of this comedic sense with their lyrical themes, this kind of goes into the topic I discussed in the beginning of this video, where grindcore also had lyrical themes to do with like dark humor and comedy, which I know that's nothing explicitly exclusive to just grindcore. I mean, death metal, black metal, thrash metal, and the likes all have bands that do comedic lyrical themes, but it seems like with grindcore, I've always felt like that was more welcomed. And as I stated earlier in this video as well, Anal Cunt was kind of like this odd harbinger for like allowing comedic types of presentation with their lyrics, but for some reason I've always felt like grindcore welcomes it, mainly because of it being so radically random with just how crazy the music is. It invites like crazy ideas that are not always like serious or like grotesque topics. Bands you'll come across that are labeled as grind but also have a lot of comedic value with them would be something like Macabre with their album Dahmer, which, I mean, it's just like a black comedy album. Sure, it has elements of death metal and thrash metal, but there's still also portions of grind when it gets to the more chaotic parts that, I mean, it's all like satirical comedic bits all about serial killers, which I know is kind of perverse, but it's like really just a black comedy metal album is what this is, which again, you start realizing it within the realms of grind. Other examples I can give you that aren't as dark and twisted but still have comedic effects would be something like Captain Cleanoff, Milking the Goat Machine, which is all parodies to do with metal but with like goat references for some reason. Then there's this band called Hatebeak, which had members of Pig Destroyer playing grindcore. It's just the vocalist was this African gray parrot making noises over everything, which was a band for a while. Then there's the band Sockweb that was in the style of death grind, but with their album the vocalist was an 8-year-old girl screaming over everything, which was a legit band for a while. Along with Grindmother, which they only released I think 2 albums if that, and it's this grandmother basically who's like I think either late 60s or early 70s being the vocalist for a grindcore band, which is just, again, I feel like in terms of presentation and what you're hearing, it's full of lunacy and has this comedic effect with it that you just have to hear it or see it to believe it. Oh, and I can't end this portion of like comedic grindcore bands without mentioning Gudalax, which I know that's more in the region now of gore grind, but maybe it's just because I saw them at the Maryland Death Fest last month, but having a band literally all about the lyrical themes of feces and how they dress and perform on their live shows, it's like some of the dumbest shit I've ever seen that just entertains me so much because of just how incredibly degenerate it is, that it's funny as all hell. And that's the thing, again, when it comes to anything adjacent or is grind, it kind of invites these just comedic bands for some reason, and all I can think of is it has to do with the fact that because of it being such a radical sounding genre, these radical ideas don't always have to be serious. Or maybe I'm just diving too deep into this. Anyway, getting back on track here, when we get to the late 2000s to the early 2010s, another wave of grindcore bands was starting to emerge that was really just keeping true to its original sound. Noteworthy names that were either releasing albums more frequently during this time or forming during the late 2000s and 2010s would be stuff like PLF or Pulverizing Lethal Force, Cretin, which is just basically a Repulsion worship band, Fuck the Facts, who named their band after one of these songs from Naked City, which I always thought was pretty cool, along with Knock Eye, Fiend, Eternal Rot, and Death Toll 80K, which is one of my personal favorite grindcore bands to come out of Finland. But without question, the album that is most celebrated among grindcore fans that was released during this time period easily goes to Insect Warfare with their 2007 full-length album, World Extermination. This is an album that is by the numbers grindcore. There's really nothing different about it. It sticks with the strengths of grindcore to its fullest extent, and I really do think that is to why it resonated with so many grindcore fans, that everyone I talk to that says they enjoy grindcore or knows of it always talks about this album in high regard, from the vocal performance, the drum performance, the wild chaotic guitar riffs going all over the place. It's basically one of those albums that, again, it's nothing groundbreaking or new, but it's the total package for everything you would want. Although it is worth mentioning that if you want more albums like Insect Warfare that, again, it's nothing groundbreaking but it sticks to everything you would want, that I kind of breezed over by because I didn't know where to put them in the timeline, but I would recommend bands like Nyctophobic, Nausea, Phobia, and Excruciating Terror. Diving deeper into the timeline of the 2010s within grindcore, this is not only where we would get even more bands trying to capture the sounds of bands from the past, but now we're starting to see a little bit more exploration and experimentation within this approach, one of which being quite the standout, Full of Hell, which to some people it's like really innovative and very different for grind, and other people consider it to be false grind because it loses its edge and direction for what grindcore is all about, considering the fact that Full of Hell experiments in all different directions. So they kind of seem to have like this split viewpoint among the fan base. But regardless though, they've gained a lot of success, at least commercially, compared to most grindcore bands, so I'll give them that. And I think what their approach is, it's another melting pot where grindcore is just one of the ingredients they're all blending together. For example, if you were to go through the discography of Full of Hell, it's like 1 minute it's power violence, other minutes it's hardcore punk, then it's noise, it might be death metal or another form of extreme metal, it might get a little sludgy, then it gets into grindcore or cyber grind. Like, see, again, it's just going in so many different directions that it feels like a mixture between Napalm Death meets Weekend Nachos meets The Body meets Merzbow. Like, it's a lot. It's very disjointed, but if you're looking for things that you want a lot of exploration, you don't really want one thing that it pigeonholes itself in, I can absolutely see as to why Full of Hell appeals to music fans that want forms of experimentation to be very sporadic. That being said, I think the band that does it to the absolute best in terms of what it can do would be Endin with their album from 2017, Through the Mirror. An album to this day I've always stated as it's a musical representation of what a clusterfuck would sound like. And I'll state that over and over again because this is one of my all-time favorite grindcore related albums ever. And I say grindcore related because it's really hard to tell you guys that Endin's just a grindcore band. There's so many things happening just like Full of Hell, but I think the big difference between Endin and Full of Hell is not really the subgenres they play around with, but the fact that Endin sounds a lot more emotive than anything Full of Hell ever released. But I will tell you guys, the one thing that's consistent about Endin that makes them within the realms of grindcore is the vocal approach of anything that they do, because it is so ear-piercing and harsh, but also guttural and just like, hits you in the gut, that the range of the vocal execution on here, it is pure grindcore as it kind of gets. But my god, I stated it before, but I'll state it here again. This is the musical representation of a clusterfuck, and I've been absolutely in love with it ever since I discovered it back in 2017. And if you really want something innovative, which I know it's not for everyone when it comes to music, but if you're looking for something innovative in grindcore, I cannot recommend it enough to be Endin. I guess it's also worth mentioning the band Nails, which I feel like I'm going to get shit for this because it feels like no one really knows what they want to call Nails. Like, if you call Nails a power violence band, you will just be ripped to shred in the comments. But if you call them a grindcore band, you'll get ripped to shreds as well. If anything, I feel like the one album that it's really hard to state that it's not grindcore related in some aspect would be their debut full-length album, Unsilent Death, which, I'll be honest, this album slays. I really am quite a fan of it. Maybe not as much as albums after, but if you're looking for just really primitive, dark, and pissed off sounding music that, again, is absolutely in vein and related to grind in the 2010s, then yeah, Nails' Unsilent Death I do feel like is worth mentioning within the timeline for grindcore, because this album was quite a big deal. I mean, I remember being in high school and people would talk about Nails like they're the next hot thing to come out in extreme music. However, when it comes to these newer grindcore bands that were either forming or making waves during the 2010s to even present day, without a shadow of a doubt, the one that is the most celebrated and cherished right now would easily go to Wormrot. Ever since their second full-length album in 2011, Dirge, was released, it seemed like to everyone this was a must-need-to-know band if you're a fan of grindcore. As when it comes to the track listing, it's really short, the album lengths are really short, there's a lot of songs, and they were signed, or I believe they still are signed, to Earache, which gave people hope, or at least somewhat of a nostalgia of when, Earache was all about promoting all of these like really extreme bands in their heyday. It kind of feels like, we're revitalizing that, at least for this label, with Wormrot. Add to the fact that when it comes to their musicianship, it's quite the standout as well, because obviously the vocals are absolutely killer, the drumming is insanely pulverizing, but I've always found to be such a standout with Wormrot is their guitar riffs. They actually have riffs compared to most grindcore bands, because yeah, it's chaotic as fuck as everything else I've been talking about, but there's melody, there's rhythm within all of that chaos, and that's such a hard thing to do, yet Wormrot makes it somewhat of like a normal thing within their songwriting and attributes that I've always thought has made them to be something of a standout. It's something you can actually latch onto, believe it or not, within grindcore, and I think this is to why their music has aged like fine wine. Which I would say it would become really apparent and done to their fullest extent on their latest album released back in 2022, Hiss. Because yeah, it's really chaotic and bombastic like everything else, but again, melodies, there's hooks, there's rhythm with that guitars, but it doesn't sacrifice the chaos of the blast beats going, up and down and all over the place, so the vocals throwing you around like a rag doll, and it's even all the more impressive during some portions on the album, especially on the outro track, where violins are being incorporated almost in this kind of like orchestral kind of effect that is just something that, let's be real, when do you ever think of any kind of orchestral composition over grindcore? Like, that just seems impossible, and Wormrot was able to do it on their album Hiss, and I can only imagine what they got in store for us if they continue on from here on out. As for present day grindcore, it's still going strong to this day as new bands emerge every year, or other bands are starting to take that approach into consideration. Bands worth mentioning would be Noisy Neighbor, Caustic Wound, Morgue Breath, one of my personal favorite newer grindcore bands, and I would even also recommend Sissy Spacek, which I know they've been around for a little over 20 plus years, But only as of recently, over the past 5 to 8 years, they've been incorporating more grindcore into their approach. That now it's like really abrasive noise grind that's super unhinged. That for whatever reason you are in the mood to just blow out your eardrums of just, unadulterated noise grind, definitely check out some of Sissy Spacek work. Although, if you're looking for something really abnormal for newer grindcore bands, then I would recommend this group that I only discovered last week, but it's really interesting stuff. That being this band called Squid Pisser, that obviously takes a lot of influence from the band The Locust, where The Locust is more in the region of like experimental power violence, punk that kind of leaned into the ideas of cybergrind for a bit. Squid Pisser's taken that approach, but just making it all the more bombastic, abrasive, and weird with all the electronics they throw together. It's not necessarily grindcore, but it's very adjacent, and at times they lean into that approach. That, again, if you're looking for something really just off the rails of the beaten path of grind, and you want it to just be bombastic, crazy with all experimentation, hitting you in every different direction that never lets up, some of the records by Squid Pisser is quite the listen. In my closing remarks for grindcore, I've always found it to be such an interesting genre because even though it's like really simplistic and primitive with its approach, it never fails to sound radical and extreme no matter how many different variations I hear of it. And with the world being as messed up as it is, there's always going to be politically charged music for decades to come that will always resonate within the grindcore community and its music. What's also interesting about grindcore is even though it's nowhere as big as, say, black metal or death metal, what's interesting about it is this international appeal that it has, because I've been talking about recently in this video that, death metal, like say with Florida and Sweden, they all have their certain attributes with it, or black metal with Norway, Sweden, Finland, and the United States, they all have different attributes accustomed to their own unique locations. With grindcore, it seems to be very international, where regardless of what band you discover from what country, they all kind of share the same approach musically. Thus, because of that, I feel like it's really easy to get acquainted with grindcore. If you like one of the bands, it's kind of impossible to ignore or disapprove of anything else you'll come across in grindcore. And sure, maybe it can be a bit stagnant as everyone's just kind of doing the same thing of abrasive wall of noise and just vocals screaming, shouting, and grunting over it with just blast beats pummeling you to obliteration. But, I mean, it's consistent though. And I feel like consistency is what creates scenes. It's what creates, a certain form of this passionate following, and grindcore clearly showcases that. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Like always, I really hope you guys discovered something new and you enjoyed it. To the best of my ability, I'll try to provide links to what was playing in the background, and once again, let me remind you, links are provided to Necroharmonic, as they absolutely deserve any bit of support that they can get with some of the purchasing of merch that they have. And other than that, just really curious to know what you think of grindcore, what you would want to see next in this whole explicit history video series that I got going, and that's like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.